Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming back to our conference this afternoon. We have Jonathan Neale with his talk entitled Climate Jobs or Climate Breakdown. Now, Jonathan is a writer of plays, novels, and nonfiction. He has been a climate activist for 16 years, much of that working with trade unions. His most recent book is Fight the Fire, Green New Deals and Global Climate Jobs, which you can download for free from The Ecologist. So Jonathan, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, I'll start. I want to start first by saying a bit about the last COP in Glasgow, because it represented an important change in climate politics that we have to register and we have to think about very carefully. What happened let me compare it to what happened before. I've been to quite a lot of COPs, and there have been two before that were really important turning points. One in Copenhagen in 2009, one in Paris in 2015. But with all of them, the COP process there's a sort of theater that happens there. And what happens in the theater is that for 2 weeks there are meetings, and there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of noise in the meeting, and everybody is saying, oh dear, we may not come to any conclusion that works. And then on the last day, the Friday, they meet well into the night, sometimes well into the next morning. They're anguished, some people cry, and then they come out finally with a resolution where they come together, all the countries of the world, and the NGOs and all the mainstream commentators and so on say, well, thank heavens for that. This is a step forward. And it's not perfect, they say. There are some things wrong with it. We have much more to do, but this is a step forward. Until Glasgow, this was the pattern. But there was a problem with that piece of theater, which is that before COVID, after every COP, the amount of emissions in the atmosphere went up in the next year. That is to say, the result of the COP is a step backwards. It's often, if you look, 1/2 of the emissions since 1750, 1/2 of the emissions, the level of emissions that's staying in the air for CO2 and other greenhouse gases, 1/2 of it has been put up there since 1985. 1/4 of it has been put up since 2005. Not only that, but the amount of emissions that are deposited in the air to stay there for 100 years, in the case of CO2, the amount of emissions that are deposited have been going up year by year by year. So we have not been progressing. Renewable energy and so on has been tried in small amounts, but emissions are constantly going up. This is the Paris Agreement of 2015 is a good example. That was hailed as an agreement that made a large difference. But given the actual promises that different countries made in Paris in 2015, I added them all up. And that what they came to was an agreement that on a global scale, emissions would rise until 2035, when they would begin to decline. And by 2045 or 2050, emissions would be down to the level that they were at, annual emissions to the level that they were at in 2015, which is far, far too high. That was the actual agreement. Now, a very important social force entered the arena, which was the climate strikers. And they were enormously important in changing the entire global conversation. First of all, because they were the first time that the climate movement had ever mobilized entire organic groups, communities of people. Before, we had always bought out, communities had resisted big extractivist projects, but for climate, we always brought out minorities on marches and protests and so on, and occupations all over the world. This has been my life for many years, organizing that. These were minorities. What the climate strikers in the schools did was they bought out the majority of the school kids in the school. They organized majorities, they organized communities, they organized strikes, which was a transition, which was taking up the long Swedish tradition of the labor movement. They organized strikes, and strikes are always an act of defiance. But crucially also was Greta Thunberg's political message. She said over and over again that the leaders of the world are lying to you, that this is all greenwash, that they are not doing what has to be done. And this, she was right. This is true of the bad leaders of the world, and it's true of the good leaders of the world. None of them are doing what needs to be done on a global scale. There's a slogan, the big demonstrations, the big protests that have been going on in Lebanon over the economy since 2019. There's a slogan they chant on those demonstrations in Lebanon, which is in English it translates as "all of them" means all of them. And what they're saying is that all of the politicians in Lebanon, of every religious group, all of the politicians have failed them. And in this case, it's also true of the climate negotiations. And Thunberg said this over and over again, and her message went broad and wide. And it meant going into Glasgow that there was a change, a very important change in the performance of what happened. Before, the leaders of the world had always come at the end of the meetings. They'd come at the end and they had put together the agreement, and then they had been hailed for doing it. Obama and Xi did this in 2009 in Copenhagen and so on, but it happened each time. This time, the leaders of the world came before the conference started, gave anodyne speeches. Biden, for instance, said nothing really in his speech, but that was quite typical. And then they went away before the conference even began so that they would not be associated with what was going to happen. And President Xi of China and Putin didn't come at all, indicating their contempt for the process. And the striking thing, as the agreement, the non-agreements came, the decision to do nothing came, was that there was almost no greenwash any longer. The leaders of the world and the people who ran the UN process were more or less openly contemptuous. They weren't trying any longer. There's still greenwash elsewhere, but they weren't trying. That was one thing. The second thing was our presence outside the negotiations, the demonstrations in the face of COVID. The demonstrations by the Scottish people were wonderful, particularly the school kids demonstration of 30,000. That was very, very encouraging. And the meetings, all the alternative summits held outside the process, were much more radical than they had been before. The tone in the climate movement is becoming much more radical. But after Glasgow, we're facing a moment of sea change, and we're facing a moment in which I think everyone in the climate movement, whatever our politics and organizations, everyone is taking a very deep breath, because the scale of what we have to do is now clear. It's clear that the governments at COP, as presently constituted, are not going to do it. That means we have to go home and build country by country the movements that will make our governments take the action that needs to be taken. And we will, in some ways, I'll come to it in a moment, but in some ways we will have to be in opposition to our governments in clear opposition to them, trying to make them do things that they really do not want to do. And if we have to, replacing them, parties with new leaders, or replacing them with opposition parties, or creating new parties or something. We're going to have to get governments to act. This is difficult for the climate movement, the present climate movement we have. This is difficult for us to do. It's difficult for us to do because we have a very large NGO sector, whose mode of being is to lobby governments and to influence governments. And launching campaigns to replace governments is called politics, and they can't do it. Although everyone in the NGOs now knows it has to be done. Everyone knows. So that's, oh dear, what do we do? Then there is the strongest part of the climate movement before the strikers. The strongest part was the refusal people, the people who stopped fracking, the people who stopped the pipelines and so on, the magnificent movements against fossil fuels. But these movements are largely, the politics that people have mostly among them is a politics of not being the government, for very, very good reasons, given what governments are. But again, oh dear, how do we change? Because I think it's clear what we need to do on a global scale. Anybody who's thought about this, the previous speakers have said it, but I'll just repeat it. Anybody who's thought about this knows that what we need to do is this is what the IPCC reports say, we need to bring down emissions by more than 80% in 15 years. We need to bring down carbon dioxide emissions, which are the easiest ones to cut globally, by over 90%, by something like 95%. We need to do that again in 15 to 20 years. What we do to do that is pretty clear. We can't simply you can't cut consumption by 90%. It's madness to think people would have a 90% fall in their standard of living. And we can't really do it just through energy efficiency. We have to replace the energy system with a renewable energy system. That means several things on a global scale. One is to cover the world with renewable energy, so that all of the electricity is produced by renewable energy. The second is very big, very smart super grids that connect renewable energy over very long distances and are able to store it when necessary. The next thing is for transportation, much more public transportation, which uses much less energy, but even more important, changing all ground transportation so it's run on electricity from renewable sources. Then there is insulating all of the housing stock, all of the buildings in the world, so they use less energy, and replacing heating in all of those buildings with electrical heating from renewables, and building codes that require all new buildings to be built so that they are massively insulated, use very little energy, and only use renewable electricity. Then people have alluded before to the next one, which is industry, thermal heat in industry. And as people have said, there are technical challenges here with steel, and to some extent chemicals. But I think I like to believe that we can solve that probably with hydrogen produced by renewable energy. And we need to ban all manufacture of cement for technical reasons. It's a big carbon dioxide emitter. And we need to stop cutting down forests. Cutting down old forests, and we need to plant new forests all over the world and not keep cutting them down to use the trees, but leave the forests alone once we plant them. We can also make some changes in agriculture, but contrary to what you read, it's not a big sector for emissions, and we can make some cuts there, but it's difficult because we need the consent of the small farmers of the global south, and that will take time. Okay, now this is what needs to be done. And anybody who thinks about it knows that I've been part of the climate jobs movement, which is basically union campaigns to get climate jobs, but it's there's also the Green New Deals, but it's basically the idea is that we've waited for the markets to do this. We've waited a very long time for the markets to do this, and the markets have not done this. It's very important to understand with energy, just with the generation of electricity, with energy, the amount of fossil fuels used in energy keeps going up. On a global scale of total global energy use, 2% is accounted for by wind and solar power. 2%. That is renewables have been increasing, but fossil fuels have been increasing too, and are on a much larger scale. So what we need to do is not only have more renewable energy, we need to have climate jobs, Green New Deals, which within 15 to 20 years, we can say that except for a few niche uses, we will make the production and sale of fossil fuels illegal on a global scale, the same way as anthrax is now illegal. We need to work towards that. Once we work towards that, we don't need to worry about subsidies for fossil fuels. We don't need to worry about the Jevons paradox. We don't need to worry about trade. We've got a rule. And that needs to be the rule we go for. And that's to say we need to go all the way. And we need to do this in the global north and in the global south. People often talk as if the industrialized part of the world is in the global north. At the moment, 1/2 of the industrial job workers in the world are in 3 countries. Those countries are China, India, and Pakistan. They have 1/2 of the industrial workers in the world. Very large parts of the global south have industrialized, still with many peasants, but industrialized, and with very badly paid industrial workers. So if you measure the production in dollars, it seems very small, but if you measure it in emissions and you measure it in people's jobs, it's very large. In 2000, only a very small proportion, I can't remember how much of emissions came from the global south. In 2019, 62% of global emissions came from the global south, and that percentage is increasing steadily. What this means is that we need an energy transformation north and south. What would be obscene is if what happened was that the global south reduced its industrial production. That's not what people want. That's people in the global south want desperately to escape from the traps of poverty. And so what we need is massive programs for climate jobs, for the government programs to climate jobs, because the private sector is not going to do it in the south, in the north, but we need the same thing in the global south. Climate jobs, I've written a book on this, and the number of jobs needed works out at about 1 million jobs in Britain, 1 million jobs in South Africa, 7 or 8 million jobs in the United States, 20 million jobs in India. Very large government projects, and government projects that are dedicated to development, but on a different model, dedicated to development through renewable energy. So using renewable energy to make poverty history. That's what we need. We need to develop these globally, and the movement to do so is growing. But there are problems. How long have I got? I'll just outline the political problems and maybe we come back to it, because the amazing thing is all of the governments haven't done that. All of them haven't done that. They can certainly afford to do that. The experience of COVID is that the United States government spent more. They spent more in 2020 and in 2021, the last year of Trump and the first year of Biden. They spent more on COVID recovery measures in total than the United States government had spent in real terms on military expenditure in World War II. The United States under Trump in 2020 was spending more on COVID recovery measures than we would have needed that year for the necessary climate jobs all over the world. The money is absolutely there. This is on a much larger scale than the 2008 rescue of the banks, but it's there. When governments go to war, they spend the money. The money is there, and they spend it. We know the money is there now. We know they can spend it. Okay. So this means that we're going to have to have in a sense, the most important things we need. We need a climate movement that walks on two legs in two streams. One stream is what we already have, which is resistance. And resistance to fossil fuels in all the forms. The stuff the first speaker was talking about, that movement is beautiful and absolutely necessary. But we also need political movements of one kind or another to change government policy, to make governments actually act, to make governments do what needs to be done. The very good news about this is we don't need to win this. We don't need to win climate jobs or Green New Deal in every country in the world simultaneously. What we need to do is win in one country. If we win in Britain or South Africa or the United States or Brazil, and we massively increase the number of jobs for working class people, we start to get, we're on course to get emissions down to nothing. The country can afford it, all of these things. We will have demonstrated to everybody in the world will see that. And suddenly the argument for doing it will be enormous. We will be able to do it. But have I got about 8 minutes to go, Catalina? Is that about right? Okay. But we need to realize two things. One is
questions. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, yeah. We need to realize what we're up against politically. It's odd that the leaders of the world haven't done more. And why haven't they? I think there are three reasons. One is the obvious reason that in many places, the fossil fuel corporations are very powerful. In some countries, enormously powerful. And they have done everything they can to prevent action on the climate. That's one group of people. But those are not the majority of important politicians and world leaders, and the majority of leaders of corporations are not that invested in the fossil fuel economy. You can see that the majority of world leaders want to do something. And the majority of the very rich corporate leaders want to do something. They too usually have children and grandchildren. They read the same scientists we read. They watch David Attenborough and other people on the television. They understand what all the rest of us understand, and they want to do something. But the only way to do it, the only way that anybody has come up with that is going to do it, means moving outside the market. It means massive government action. It means governments directly employing people to do this. It means a very considerable increase in public spending. It means everything that 40 years of neoliberalism has told everyone we cannot do. And the political leaders of the world find it extremely hard to break from this. And that's why Al Gore's wonderful movie had had 90 minutes of enormous argument about what we had to do, followed by 1 minute of useless things that we might do. It's why the COP happens, is that the leaders of the world and the corporate leaders of the world know we have to do something. They just cannot bring themselves to do what has to be done. And on top of that, there is the competition between different countries and different national economies in an increasingly an increasingly troubled global capitalist system. I'm not saying it's going to explode or implode, but it's a situation where it's difficult for the leaders of particular countries to imagine. They don't want to. America doesn't want to do something unless China does it, and the other way around. So that's what we're up against politically. In that situation, we're going to have to change how we are in important ways. We're going to build the national movements. That means it means building a climate movement that is built on the majority of the population, on ordinary people. We're going to have to build a movement that is supported by, given the scale of the political project, that has enthusiastic support from industrial workers in India and from peasants in China and from transport workers in Latin America and so on. We're going to have to build that kind of movement. That's not what we're used to doing in the climate movement, and it's not what people have done very well in the last 10 years either. But that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to wed ourselves to a new process. I'll end with two thoughts about what happens if we don't. I don't believe that we have only 8 years. Maybe we have only 8 years. We have less than, we're going to go over 1.2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. That's pretty clear. I think we're going to at least hit 2 degrees. The question for me now is, when can we take action to avoid how soon can we take action to avoid the very worst? And in that, maybe we have 10 years, maybe we have 20, it's even possible we have 40. I don't know. And the truth is, nobody else knows either. But if we don't take action in time, we face a world of desperate refugees, hundreds of millions of desperate refugees. We face war, many different kinds of war. We face an enormous increase in racism against refugees. We face famine on a very large scale. These things are already happening in some countries, but they will become global. Enormous economic costs, which will lead to brutal governments. And when we hit that situation, unless we have an enormously well-organized climate movement and labor movement and social movements, we will see the tanks on the streets. We will see brutal dictatorships, and our new brutal dictators will talk in a green language. They will say, we have not sacrificed enough. We have ruined the planet. Therefore, we will all have to sacrifice. And the truth is that we will sacrifice and they will not. And when I think about that time, I know that hundreds of millions will die. But what I really think about, I know it's a cliche to talk about your grandchildren, but my 6 grandchildren are not cliches. And I don't so much worry about what they'll suffer, whether they'll die. I worry about, in order to survive that time, what they will have to do, what they will have to see, what they'll have to be part of, what orders they will have to follow, what torture they will be complicit in, which army they will fight in. And I worry about what that will do to them as human beings and what that would do to human society. So we must stop that. And the only way we can do that is to imagine among ourselves now that it will be possible, that it will be possible to mobilize human beings. All of our experience as human beings is that there has been in our lives, for most of us, an enormous amount of love, and for many of us, a great deal of suffering and a great deal of cruelty. Both of those are part of what human beings are capable of. Going forward in the next generation, I think we have no choice but to bet on love and to hope that we can build a large enough movement, country by country, for climate jobs, that we can rescue not only humanity from a terrible future, but that we can rescue all living things on the planet. That's the task for the next generation. Thank you.